how do you think this pandemic so far is affecting the standing, the view of the United States in the global sense? I mean, it really does seem that, both from the international response, the contrast between, say, Cuba and China and the assistance and the solidarity they're offering other countries and what the U.S. has been, doing internationally, the gap there seems to be very large. But even just in the sense of the inability of, the so-called greatest country on earth by its own reckoning to deal with any of these logistical challenges. Around the world, what do you think this does overall? And maybe it's too hard to know right now, to the standing of how the U.S. is viewed and how that affects its ability to act on the world stage.
Let's just take a little distance from that question and look at how, for instance, Modi, Bolsonaro, and Trump have addressed this issue right now. And I must say that each of them have handled it, it seems, differently. Bolsonaro is saying no lockdown, this is crazy. He seems to be Trump 3 weeks back, okay? Now, he was India's Republic Day guest. So Modi and he get along very well. Now, Trump, after a denial phase, went on to a phase where he wanted to be a war leader. Now he seems to be vacillating again. He really doesn't know what to do. And his thing is, well, do I collapse the economy or do I try and fight the pandemic? So he seems to be going on where Boris Johnson was about 2 weeks back. So this is a sort of waffling model, as I would call it. Modi, starting from, shall we say, I'm the strong guy, I'm going to fight this boat that he is on right now. I don't know where he will go in 3 weeks. But at least he, while not really addressing the problem in terms of the whole national challenge we face, at least scientifically has understood one thing, that if the pandemic continues, India's health system will be completely overwhelmed. And we are looking at very, very large numbers of deaths. And that would be politically something for any leader. This is not something they can face. So you do see that each of the countries are having different responses. And a part of it is we don't get the same unified response, shall we say, which we would expect the right-wing figures like Modi, Bolsonaro, Trump, Boris Johnson, and all of them to give. So we do see some fractures on that. The other thing that what you raised, what is the role of the United States? I think it's very clear that the United States under Trump has basically said we do not have a global view of how US should lead. We have only a view of how we look at different countries, and it will be completely dog-eat-dog model, that whoever can extract benefits from the relationships, they should do so. We are strong, we can browbeat people, we can use our economic clout, our political clout, military threats, and all of that to really try and dominate over the world politically, economically, and militarily. So the other part of it, which is that the United States really does not see itself as a leader of the global community, which is the cover it used to have till Mr. Trump became the president. He said that I don't need to lead the global community, they have to follow me. And that's their role. And my role is to extract the best I can get. Having said that, therefore, he abdicates the role of the global leader. This is not only what was happening earlier, where he went on this unilateral mode, the European Union doesn't count, they have to pay us for having our bases, the Koreans have to pay us, everybody has to pay the United States. Now, it was more of an extortionist model. If I have my troops to do the job of occupying your countries, you have to pay me for it. And the worst was when Iraq wanted the American troops to go. They said, yeah, you have to pay me first. So the whole model has been of one which is very different from at least the kind of relationship the US claimed it had with the rest of the world. So in some sense, it's a more, in-your-face imperialism that we have been seeing lately. In this, the problem has come when there is a global challenge, the real global challenge. The United States never recognized, at least bipartisan terms, the climate change being a global challenge. So for them, the economy was never a global challenge. It was just everybody had to open itself to the Americans while they could protect their own market. So I think the pandemic posed a completely different challenge. It's happening after 1918. We are happening really all just about 100 years later. We have a second global pandemic. We didn't have a pandemic all these years. We had threats of having one, but it really never took place. So the global system is also being tested as never before. That do we have solidarity? Do we have international cooperation? Or we also, in the process of pandemic, do beggar the neighbor policies? So shall we say all the equipment that I can get, I shall take to my country and the others can go to hell? What about medicines? Do I say patents need to be protected right now or break the patents? This is something that, if you remember the anthrax times, the US had said, I'll break the patents if necessary. We have the legal mechanism to do so, which is there, of course. So all of this are now coming to the fore. And as you can see, the US position has been, I airlift equipment, protective gear from Italy, swabs from Italy at the height of their crisis. I do not offer any support. Neither the European Union nor the United States provide any support to Italy. China did. Cuba did. Now, those are pictures that you see is automatically doing an enormous damage to the US image in the rest of the world. And particularly when Mr. Trump tries to also get the CureVac, the company which is developing a vaccine against COVID-19. These are things which show United States today in a bad light. But I know more than that, Eugene, the basic problem is the way the US has dealt with its own epidemic compared to what China has done also shows them up in a very bad light. That even after 3 months, the test kits were not there. So CDC's test kits failed. After that, it's taken almost a month. Even now, the US testing figures don't look that good compared to what the needs are. So what you are seeing as cases which are actually being identified as COVID cases are really a tip of the iceberg, because if you see Wuhan, the figures we have is that in the initial phase, 87% or 84% of the patients were not identified. They were really unidentified cases. And even after the whole COVID, the whole epidemic in Wuhan was over, the figures that they are now saying is at least 60% of the people were never identified. That's their figures. So that would show that even with extensive testing, they could not identify 60% of the cases. If countries like the United States, like India, where we are, if we don't identify or don't do extensive testing, then we have probably a much higher number of people in the population that we see. And the sudden rise of figures in the United States, particularly New York, shows its extension of testing. That's all that there is to it. So I think the United States comes off not only the way it has behaved internationally, but also the failure it has had on its home front. CDC was respected all over the world till this fiasco when they could not provide the leadership. Now, why it has happened, how it has happened is a different issue. Who's to blame for it is a different issue. But America's credibility to lead the world fades if it is not able to lead its own country.
No, absolutely. Final question here is, overlaying all of this, of course, is a massive economic dislocation. I mean, exactly, what it'll be, I think is unknown, where the bottom will be here, but obviously significant things happening, ructions in the market there. And you spoke to the issue of the system facing one of its biggest crises in some time. I mean, it does feel just the viral response alone for many, of the quote unquote world's democracies, whether you even call it the system of neoliberal capitalism, whatever people want to say, that the viral response alone has created something of at least a potential crisis of legitimacy. But now with this issue of a perhaps economic, certainly severe contraction, if not deep depression, that also seems to add to the crisis and the challenge that's facing many of these nations, particularly Western nations, and the model that they've upheld I don't want to be the sky is falling type of person here, but it does seem as if so much of the triumphalism, perhaps, of the post-Soviet era starting to look shaky.
Well, there are two things. I would say here, one is that the economists also do not understand the economy anymore. The financial people are today ruling really the economic, shall we say, pantheon. And they don't understand the real economy anymore. They understand how money flows, where does it flow. They understand securities, they understand stocks, they understand derivatives, but they really don't understand the economy in that sense. And now what you are saying, the disjunction between the economy as a real economy and what the stock market thinks is the economy. So I think that dichotomy between the real and the pseudo-real economy, I will not say it's a virtual economy. It has elements of the real world obviously in it, but it is not the economy per se. Now, how do you reconcile these two things is the crisis that what you call the crisis of legitimacy of capital today. That all the things they have said is what is efficiency, or how it shows efficiency, the value of the stocks really shows the efficiency of the companies, all of that is now falling. Now, what you are going to need in the next 6 months to a year is how to sustain the people's consumption. If you can't feed them, then you are going to have riots on your hands. And this is really the Great Depression times. So you need to create demand in the system by pumping money at one end, which is what the so-called $1 trillion, 1.5 trillion, these are basically just numbers being pumped into the economy. You can pump money into the economy, but if there is no consumption, where does that money go? So I think the real issue is going to be, how do you put food on the table for the people? How do you sustain the schools, the colleges? How do you sustain people's lives? Those are the fundamental issues. If you can take care of that, then you have a hope of a rebound of the economy at a future date. But if you let all of that collapse just by pumping money into the banks and into the system, some so-called helicopter money, you're not going to really revive the real economy. And I think that's a key problem. And at the moment, the way the lockdowns are operating, international trade is operating, the only countries which will survive is those who have manufacturing in their shores, and they have demand on their shores. So then you can really isolate yourself partially. Certain sectors which are export dependent would go, but you still have a possibility of retooling yourself to supply your local economy and ride out the crisis. But if you don't do that, and that's a problem with a lot of the Western economies, they don't have any manufacturing left. So how do they function in times where you are sundering, as it were, the relationships between countries? I really have no answer to that. But I think what you said is absolutely right, that it should fundamentally bring into question the whole paradigm that has happened, that in the last 30, 40, 50 years, where you had the so-called financial world take over the real economy. The last word I would say, nothing changes unless we have people on the ground willing to change it. And I think this is the challenge, that while the capitalist system is in a crisis, neoliberal ideology is in a crisis, the alternative, that has still to emerge in the people's minds. So Bernie Sanders might have made socialism look a little better, but it's really the responsibility of the next generation of people to raise the flag which questions the fundamentals of the system. That will determine where it will go. Otherwise, after 2 years, pandemics will come. But once you have the vaccine, you have the medicines, you will probably within 12 to 18 months be able to come out of it. What happens to society will depend on how radicalization takes place within society, and we are able to project an alternative who would have handled this crisis in a very different way and much more people-centered way. I think that's a challenge all of us have.
Well, absolutely, it was a pleasure to have you here with us on Breakthrough News. Prabir, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you to be here.